Caleb grew up in a modest neighborhood in the heart of the city. His family lived paycheck to paycheck, but their tiny apartment was always filled with warmth and laughter. From a young age, Caleb showed an exceptional talent for drawing. While other kids played outside, Caleb would spend hours sketching the world as he saw it, the towering buildings, the bustling streets, the faces of strangers passing by. His mother, a nurse who worked long hours, always made sure to encourage his creativity. "Never let anyone tell you your art isn't worth something," she would say, her eyes filled with pride. As he grew older, Caleb's passion only deepened. He fell in love with the way colors could convey emotions, the way a single stroke could tell an entire story. He started experimenting with different mediums, painting on anything he could find, old scraps of wood, discarded pieces of cardboard, even the backs of cereal boxes. But no matter how hard he worked, Caleb felt an invisible barrier blocking his path. The art world was a fortress, and he didn't have the key. Every rejection email felt like a punch to the gut. He had applied to countless galleries, hoping someone would take a chance on his work. "We regret to inform you," became a phrase he knew too well. Yet, he didn't give up. He scraped together what little money he had, saving every dime he earned from his part-time job at a hardware store, to buy art supplies. His friends told him to consider a different career. "Man, the art world is all about who you know," his best friend, Tony, would say. "You think they care about talent?" But Caleb refused to let go of his dream. One day, Caleb heard about a prestigious art gallery downtown. Whitaker Fine Arts was known for hosting exclusive exhibits and was frequented by the city's wealthiest art collectors. It was run by Mr. Whitaker, a man who had built a reputation as a tastemaker in the art world. If anyone could launch Caleb's career, it was him. Caleb spent weeks preparing for the meeting. He selected his best pieces, poured his heart into each one, and even practiced how he would pitch his work. Standing outside the gallery with his portfolio in hand, Caleb couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and dread. The gallery itself was imposing, with tall glass windows that reflected the city skyline. Inside, the walls were lined with vibrant, expensive paintings that seemed to radiate wealth. Taking a deep breath, Caleb pushed open the heavy doors. The air inside was cool and smelled faintly of fresh paint and polished wood. A few well-dressed patrons wandered the space, their conversations low and hushed. At the center of it all was Mr. Whitaker, a tall man with a sharp suit and an even sharper gaze. His silver hair was slicked back, and his demeanor exuded an air of superiority. Caleb approached him nervously. "Excuse me, Mr. Whitaker," he began, his voice steady, despite his nerves. "My name is Caleb, and I'm an artist. I was hoping you might take a look at my work." Whitaker glanced at him briefly, his expression unreadable. "I'm very busy," he replied curtly, but Caleb persisted. "Please, sir. I've worked so hard on these pieces. I believe they have something unique to offer." With a sigh of irritation, Whitaker motioned for Caleb to show his portfolio. Caleb carefully laid out his paintings, each one bursting with emotion and vibrancy. One piece depicted a young boy standing in a field of sunflowers, his face lit with hope. Another showed a city street at sunset, the golden light reflecting off puddles on the pavement. Each painting told a story, rich with detail and feeling. Whitaker examined them for a moment before scoffing. "These are mediocre at best," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. "There's no originality here. It's all derivative." Caleb felt his chest tighten. "But, these pieces represent my life, my perspective." Whitaker cut him off with a dismissive wave. "Perspective? What perspective could someone like you possibly have that hasn't already been done 1,000 times over? You think this is the kind of work my clients want to see? I suggest you take up a different hobby, young man." A few patrons nearby turned to watch the exchange, their curious gazes burning into Caleb's skin. The humiliation was unbearable, but Whitaker wasn't done. "Art is about refinement," Whitaker continued, his voice louder now, as if he wanted the whole room to hear. "It's about understanding the subtle nuances of form and texture. Frankly, you don't have it. You'll never have it. Caleb's fists clenched at his sides. Every fiber of his being wanted to argue, to shout, to defend himself, but the words caught in his throat. He could feel the weight of every rejection he'd ever faced pressing down on him, and for a brief moment, he wondered if Whitaker was right. But then, something inside him shifted. The fire that had always fueled his art burned brighter than ever. He straightened his shoulders and looked Whitaker in the eye. "Thank you for your time," Caleb said, his voice calm but firm. "One day, you'll see my work again. And when you do, you'll regret dismissing me." Whitaker smirked, clearly unconvinced. "We'll see," he said with a shrug, turning his attention to another patron. Caleb gathered his portfolio and left the gallery, his heart pounding. The cool air outside hit his face, and he took a deep breath. His humiliation had been public, his confidence shaken, but he wasn't defeated. If anything, the encounter had only strengthened his resolve. He would prove Whitaker wrong, not out of spite, but because he believed in the power of his art. As Caleb walked home, his mind raced with ideas. He didn't know how he would do it yet, but he was certain of one thing: his art would speak for itself, and no amount of prejudice or elitism would silence his voice. This was just the beginning. Caleb's days after his humiliating encounter with Mr. Whitaker were a blur of frustration and self-doubt. He couldn't get the gallery owner's sneering words out of his head. For days, he painted with a restless energy, pouring his anger and disappointment onto every canvas. Yet, no matter how hard he tried, he felt like something was missing. His art, which had once been a source of joy and expression, now felt like a battleground. One afternoon, as Caleb sat at the park sketching passers-by, an elderly woman paused to admire his work. She had a cane in one hand and a tote bag filled with art supplies in the other. Her silver hair framed a kind but sharp face, and her eyes sparkled with curiosity. "That's quite the talent you have there," she said, her voice warm and encouraging. Caleb looked up, surprised. Compliments on his work were rare, especially from strangers. "Thank you," he replied, offering a small smile. The woman introduced herself as Mrs. Henderson, a retired artist who had once been a prominent figure in the local art scene. She had stepped away from the limelight years ago, but still kept a close eye on budding talent in the community. "You have an eye for detail," she continued, pointing at the sketch. "But there's more in you than what you're putting on paper." Caleb was taken aback. He hesitated, then told her about his struggles, his dream of becoming a recognized artist, and his humiliating encounter at Whitaker Fine Arts. Mrs. Henderson listened intently, nodding now and then but never interrupting. When he finished, she placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You're talented, Caleb," she said firmly. "But talent alone won't get you far in this world, especially for someone like you. The art world isn't kind to outsiders. But that doesn't mean you can't break through. You just need to find your voice, the thing that makes your work undeniable." Over the next few weeks, Mrs. Henderson took Caleb under her wing. She invited him to her cozy home, which doubled as an art studio. The walls were lined with her old paintings, bold, abstract pieces that seemed to leap off the canvas. Her style was entirely different from Caleb's, yet there was an energy in her work that resonated with him. "Art isn't just about technique," she told him one day as they worked side by side. "It's about telling a story. Your story. People want to feel something when they look at your work." Mrs. Henderson pushed Caleb to experiment with new techniques and materials. She taught him to play with light and shadow, to layer textures in ways that added depth and complexity. She encouraged him to draw from his personal experiences, the vibrant chaos of his childhood neighborhood, the quiet strength of his mother, the raw emotions he felt every time he picked up a brush. Slowly, Caleb's style began to evolve. His paintings became more dynamic, more alive. He started blending realism with abstract elements, creating pieces that were both deeply personal and universally relatable. One painting depicted a young boy standing in the rain, his face half hidden by a hood, with streaks of gold and blue swirling around him. Another showed a busy city street, the figures blurred and dreamlike, as if viewed through a foggy lens. Mrs. Henderson also taught Caleb about the business side of art. She helped him create an online portfolio and encouraged him to post his work on social media. At first, Caleb was skeptical. He wasn't sure anyone would notice his art in the vast sea of online content. But Mrs. Henderson insisted. "You never know who might be watching," she said with a wink. To Caleb's surprise, his posts began to gain traction. People commented on the emotional depth of his work, the way his paintings seemed to tell stories without words. His followers grew steadily, and soon, local art enthusiasts began reaching out to commission pieces. The real turning point came when a popular social media influencer, known for showcasing emerging talent, stumbled across Caleb's work. She shared one of his paintings on her account, praising its originality and emotional impact. The post went viral, garnering thousands of likes and shares. Overnight, Caleb's inbox was flooded with messages from people eager to buy his art. "I saw your painting and couldn't stop thinking about it," one message read. "How much for a commission?" "Your work is incredible," wrote another. "Do you have any pieces available for sale?" Caleb was overwhelmed but exhilarated. For the first time, he felt like his art was being seen and appreciated for what it truly was. He spent days working tirelessly to fulfill orders, each sale bringing in more money than he had ever earned before. With Mrs. Henderson's guidance, he priced his work fairly, ensuring he wasn't undervaluing himself. As his popularity grew, Caleb caught the attention of wealthy collectors and media outlets. A local magazine featured him in an article titled "The Rising Star of the City's Art Scene." They highlighted his journey, his unique style, and his determination to succeed despite the odds stacked against him. The article was shared widely, further cementing his status as an up-and-coming artist. Caleb's newfound success allowed him to dream bigger. He upgraded his small, makeshift studio to a proper workspace. He invested in high-quality materials and began planning a solo exhibition. He even started giving back to his community, hosting free art workshops for kids who, like him, came from humble beginnings. Through it all, Mrs. Henderson remained by his side, her pride in Caleb evident in every smile and encouraging word. "You've come a long way," she told him one evening as they stood in his studio, surrounded by his latest works. "But this is just the beginning. The world is finally starting to see what I've seen in you all along." Caleb nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude. He knew he wouldn't have made it this far without her guidance and belief in him. But he also knew that the journey wasn't over. There were still barriers to break, challenges to face, and dreams to chase. And as he looked at the growing collection of his work, he felt a surge of determination. He wasn't just an artist anymore. He was a force to be reckoned with. And he was just getting started. Months after Caleb's art went viral, his life began to change in ways he never imagined. His name started circulating in the art community, not just in his city, but beyond. Collectors, curators, and journalists were taking notice, and Caleb found himself fielding opportunities he'd only dreamed of before. Among these was an invitation to showcase his work at a prestigious art exhibit in New York City, a career-defining moment for any artist. The invitation came from the curator of the Metropolitan Vanguard Art Show, one of the most esteemed events in the art world. The exhibit was known for spotlighting groundbreaking talent and attracting high-profile investors, critics, and collectors. Caleb was stunned when he received the email. For a moment, he thought it was a scam, but when he saw the official logo and contact details, his heart raced with excitement. He shared the news with Mrs. Henderson, who beamed with pride. "I told you, Caleb. Your talent is undeniable. This is your time to shine," she said, squeezing his hand. Together, they spent weeks preparing for the exhibit. Caleb selected a series of pieces that represented his journey, paintings that showcased his struggles, his growth, and his triumphs. Each piece told a story, from the lonely nights of rejection to the vibrant hope that now filled his life. The day of the event arrived, and Caleb flew to New York City for the first time. The bustling streets, towering skyscrapers, and electric energy of the city overwhelmed him, but it also inspired him. This was where dreams were made, and he was determined to make the most of the opportunity. The venue was nothing short of spectacular. Housed in a sprawling, modern building with floor-to-ceiling glass walls, the exhibit buzzed with excitement. Artists from around the world had gathered to display their work, each section of the gallery showcasing a unique perspective. Caleb's area was prominently placed, and as he set up his paintings, he couldn't help but feel a mix of pride and nervousness. His name, printed in bold letters on the wall, seemed surreal: Caleb Wilson, Stories Through Color. As the doors opened and guests began to trickle in, Caleb stood by his section, answering questions and engaging with attendees. The response to his work was overwhelmingly positive. People were drawn to the emotional depth of his paintings, the way they seemed to pulse with life. One piece, titled Resilience in Motion, depicted a young boy walking through a storm, golden rays breaking through the clouds above him. Another, Urban Symphony, was a kaleidoscope of colors and textures that captured the vibrancy of city life. As the evening progressed, Caleb found himself mingling with influential figures in the art world. A woman named Victoria Hayes, a renowned art investor, approached him with a warm smile. "Your work is incredible," she said, extending her hand. "It's refreshing to see such raw emotion on canvas. Tell me, what inspired you to create these pieces?" Caleb shared his story, speaking openly about his struggles and the rejection he'd faced. He talked about how he used art to process his emotions and how Mrs. Henderson had helped him find his voice. By the time he finished, Victoria's eyes glistened with admiration. "Your journey is as powerful as your art," she said. "I'd love to discuss representing you in my gallery." The offers didn't stop there. Several collectors expressed interest in purchasing his work, and by the end of the night, Caleb had secured multiple commissions. One collector, a tech billionaire, commissioned a custom piece for his private collection, while another, a museum director, expressed interest in adding Caleb's work to a traveling exhibit. The media quickly caught wind of Caleb's success. Journalists from prominent publications interviewed him, eager to share his story. Articles with headlines like "From Rejection to Recognition, The Rise of Caleb Wilson" and "A Voice of Resilience in Modern Art" began circulating online. Caleb's Instagram following skyrocketed, and his inbox was flooded with messages from aspiring artists, fans, and collectors. What resonated most with people wasn't just Caleb's talent, but his journey. He became a symbol of resilience and hope, proof that perseverance could overcome even the toughest obstacles. His story of facing discrimination and rising above it inspired countless individuals, particularly young Black artists who saw in him a reflection of their own dreams. Caleb's earnings from the exhibit were staggering. For the first time in his life, he didn't have to worry about making rent or choosing between groceries and art supplies. He invested in high-quality materials and upgraded his studio, but he also began thinking bigger. Inspired by Mrs. Henderson's mentorship, he dreamed of creating a space where other aspiring artists could thrive, a gallery that celebrated diverse voices and provided opportunities for those who were often overlooked. Back in his hometown, Caleb began researching properties. He visited several buildings, envisioning how they could be transformed into vibrant galleries or studios. One particular space caught his eye, a historic building with large open rooms and plenty of natural light. It was perfect, but the price tag was daunting. Still, Caleb was determined. He started saving and looking for investors, knowing that this dream was worth pursuing. Throughout it all, Caleb remained grounded. He continued to visit Mrs. Henderson regularly, sharing updates and seeking her advice. "You've come so far," she told him one evening as they sat in her cozy living room. "But remember, success isn't just about what you achieve. It's about what you give back." Her words stuck with him. Caleb began hosting free workshops in his community, teaching kids the basics of drawing and painting. He partnered with local organizations to provide art supplies to schools and started a scholarship fund for young artists. His success wasn't just his own, it was a chance to uplift others and pave the way for the next generation. As Caleb's reputation grew, so did his influence. He received invitations to speak at conferences and participate in panel discussions about diversity in the art world. At one such event, he shared his vision for the future. "Art has the power to change lives," he said, his voice steady and confident. "It changed mine. And I want to make sure it continues to be a force for good, for everyone." The audience erupted in applause, and Caleb felt a surge of pride. He wasn't just an artist anymore, he was a trailblazer, a leader, and a symbol of hope. And as he stood on that stage, he knew that his journey was far from over. This was only the beginning of what he could achieve. Caleb's dream of creating a gallery that celebrated diversity and talent, regardless of background, had grown stronger with every success. His workshops and community projects had only deepened his commitment to giving other artists opportunities he never had. But there was one gallery that lingered in his mind, a place tied to his most humiliating moment, Whitaker Fine Arts. The gallery that once dismissed him as uninspired was no longer the cultural powerhouse it had been. Rumors began circulating in the art community that Mr. Whitaker's business was struggling. Collectors were moving toward more inclusive spaces, and Whitaker's old-school elitism no longer appealed to a world hungry for fresh perspectives. For Caleb, it wasn't just poetic justice, it was an opportunity. With his growing wealth and influence, he could turn Whitaker Fine Arts into something new, something meaningful. However, he wanted to handle the acquisition carefully. He didn't want Whitaker to know who was behind the deal until the moment was right. The purchase. Caleb enlisted the help of a trusted lawyer and a third-party representative to initiate the negotiations. The representative, a savvy real estate consultant, approached Whitaker under the guise of a private investor looking to expand their portfolio. At first, Whitaker was hesitant. Selling his gallery felt like admitting defeat, but the offer was too good to ignore. After months of negotiations, the deal was finalized. Whitaker signed the papers, officially transferring ownership of the gallery to Caleb, though he had no idea who the real buyer was. Once the paperwork was complete, Caleb visited the gallery for the first time as its owner. It was a surreal experience walking through the space that had once made him feel so small. The walls still held traces of Whitaker's influence, bland, uninspired pieces that catered to a narrow audience. But Caleb saw potential. He envisioned a vibrant, inclusive space filled with art that challenged, inspired, and moved people. He immediately got to work on renovations. With the help of a talented team of designers, he transformed the gallery into a modern masterpiece. Walls were painted in bold, inviting colors, and lighting was adjusted to highlight each piece in a way that made the art shine. Caleb also created a dedicated section called the Rising Voices Wing, a space reserved for underrepresented artists to showcase their work. The grand reopening. The grand reopening of the gallery was a highly anticipated event. Caleb sent out invitations to collectors, critics, and artists from all over the country. He even extended an invitation to Mr. Whitaker, framing it as a gesture of goodwill. Whitaker, now a shadow of his former self, had no idea what to expect, but was eager to reconnect with the art world. The evening of the reopening was nothing short of magical. Guests arrived in droves, dressed in elegant attire, eager to see the newly revamped gallery. The space buzzed with excitement as people explored the exhibits, each room filled with powerful, thought-provoking art. The Rising Voices Wing quickly became the star attraction, with attendees praising the bold and diverse works on display. Whitaker entered the gallery late, his posture stiff and his expression guarded. He immediately noticed the changes, the vibrancy, the energy, the life the gallery now exuded. He wandered through the rooms, his face a mix of confusion and awe. This wasn't the gallery he had left behind. It was something entirely new, something he couldn't deny was better. The revelation. The night reached its peak when Caleb stepped onto the stage in the main hall. Dressed in a tailored suit, he looked every bit the successful artist and entrepreneur he had become. The crowd hushed as he approached the microphone, his warm smile radiating confidence. "Good evening, everyone," Caleb began. "Thank you for being here to celebrate the reopening of this gallery. This space holds a special place in my heart, not because of where it started, but because of what it can become. He paused, scanning the room until his eyes landed on Whitaker. Some of you might recognize this place as Whitaker Fine Arts. For years, it stood as a symbol of exclusivity, catering to a narrow vision of what art should be. But tonight, it stands for something entirely different. It stands for inclusion, for innovation, and for the voices that have been ignored for far too long. The crowd erupted into applause, but Whitaker remained frozen, his face pale. Caleb continued, his voice steady but laced with emotion. I know this gallery well, he said, locking eyes with Whitaker. I once walked through those doors as a young artist, eager to share my work with the world. I was dismissed, ridiculed, and told I would never make it. That moment could have crushed me, but instead, it fueled me. It made me stronger. The room was silent as Caleb's words hung in the air. Whitaker's expression shifted from confusion to recognition, his jaw tightening as the realization dawned. Caleb smiled faintly. And now, he said, I stand here not just as an artist but as the new owner of this gallery. The audience erupted into cheers and applause, but Whitaker looked as though the ground had been pulled out from under him. He made his way toward Caleb, his steps slow and hesitant. When he reached the stage, he stared up at the man he had once dismissed. You, Whitaker began, his voice faltering. You're the buyer? Caleb nodded. Yes, Mr. Whitaker. I am. A new chapter. Whitaker stammered, searching for words, but Caleb didn't let him flounder. Mr. Whitaker, he said, his tone calm but firm, this gallery may have rejected me, but I'm not here to do the same to you. Everyone deserves a second chance, even you. Whitaker's face crumpled with emotion. He nodded silently, too overwhelmed to speak. Caleb extended a hand. I'm offering you a chance to work with me, not as a gatekeeper but as a guide. Use your experience to help elevate the voices this gallery now represents. Whitaker hesitated, then took Caleb's hand, his grip trembling. Thank you, he said quietly, his voice barely audible. As the night wore on, Caleb mingled with the guests, his heart full. The gallery had become more than just a space for art, it was a beacon of hope, a place where talent and passion were valued above all else. For Caleb, it was the ultimate triumph, a testament to the power of perseverance and the importance of lifting others as you rise. And as he stood in the center of the bustling crowd, surrounded by art and laughter, Caleb knew this was only the beginning of his legacy. The morning after the gallery's grand reopening, Caleb arrived early, the sunlight streaming through the gallery's massive windows. The space was quiet, the echoes of the previous night's applause lingering in his mind. It had been a triumphant evening, not just for Caleb but for every artist whose work now adorned the walls. Yet, as Caleb walked through the halls, his thoughts turned to unfinished business, Mr. Whitaker. Despite the public revelation the night before, Caleb knew there was more to say. The confrontation at the gallery had been brief, and though Whitaker had seemed shaken, Caleb wanted to ensure his message was clear. Forgiveness wasn't just about moving on, it was about creating a path forward, one built on understanding and growth. The private meeting. Later that week, Caleb invited Whitaker to a private meeting in the gallery's conference room. The invitation had been simple and direct, but Caleb wondered if Whitaker would actually show up. When the time came, Caleb was pleasantly surprised to see Whitaker walking through the doors, his demeanor noticeably subdued. Gone was the arrogance that once defined him, in its place was a man who seemed humbled, perhaps even lost. Mr. Whitaker, Caleb greeted him warmly, gesturing to a chair. Thank you for coming. Whitaker nodded but said nothing, his gaze shifting around the room. Caleb took a seat across from him, the table between them feeling symbolic of the distance they'd traveled, one man once full of ambition and the other of doubt, now sitting as equals. I wanted to have this conversation in private, Caleb began. Last night, I spoke about my journey and how this gallery played a role in it. But I didn't tell the whole story. Whitaker looked up, his expression cautious. Caleb continued. When I walked through those doors years ago, I was hopeful. Nervous, but hopeful. I believed in my work, in my vision. And then, in just a few minutes, your words crushed that hope. You told me I wasn't good enough, that I didn't belong. It felt like the world had closed in on me. Whitaker's face flushed, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. I didn't realize. Caleb held up a hand to stop him. Let me finish. You didn't just dismiss my art, you dismissed me as a person. And for a while, I let your words define me. I doubted myself, questioned whether I was wasting my time. But then, something changed. Your rejection became fuel. It made me work harder, push further, and find my voice. In a way, you motivated me. Whitaker lowered his head, the weight of Caleb's words pressing down on him. I was wrong, he said finally, his voice trembling. I see that now. The things I said, they weren't just cruel, they were ignorant. I've spent so many years clinging to the past, to this narrow view of what art should be. And look where it's gotten me. An unexpected offer. Caleb leaned back, studying the man before him. This was not the same Mr. Whitaker he had faced years ago. Time and failure had softened him, stripped away the arrogance that once defined him. Caleb took a deep breath and made his decision. I didn't ask you here to humiliate you or to gloat, Caleb said. I asked you here because I believe people can change. I believe you can change. That's why I want to offer you an opportunity. Whitaker's head snapped up, his eyes widening. An opportunity? Yes, Caleb said, his tone firm but kind. You have decades of experience in the art world. While your methods and perspective may be outdated, your knowledge is still valuable. I'd like to offer you a role as a consultant for the gallery. Whitaker stared at him, stunned. You'd hire me? After everything I said? After the way I treated you? Caleb nodded. I would. But let me be clear, this isn't charity. This is about creating something better, together. You've seen the flaws in the old system firsthand, and you have the chance to help fix them. To mentor young artists, to support voices that were once ignored, just like mine was. Tears glistened in Whitaker's eyes, and for a moment, he seemed unable to speak. Finally, he managed a hoarse, thank you. I don't deserve this, but thank you. Building a legacy. Over the next few months, Whitaker embraced his new role with a humility Caleb hadn't expected. He threw himself into the work, mentoring artists, advising on curation, and even helping with community outreach programs. The collaboration wasn't always smooth, old habits died hard, but Caleb's steady leadership kept them on track. The gallery thrived under Caleb's vision. The Rising Voices Wing became a national sensation, attracting visitors from across the country. Artists who had once been overlooked now had a platform to shine, their work celebrated and sold to collectors who valued its authenticity and power. Caleb's story continued to inspire. He was invited to speak at conferences, universities, and art festivals, sharing his journey and advocating for diversity in the arts. His workshops expanded, and he launched a scholarship program in Mrs. Henderson's name, honoring the woman who had been his mentor and guide. A moment of reflection. One evening, after a long day at the gallery, Caleb stood alone in the main hall. The walls were lined with art, each piece a testament to the talent and resilience of its creator. He thought about how far he had come, from a struggling artist scraping by to a respected gallery owner and community leader. Whitaker approached him, holding 2 cups of coffee. Thought you could use this, he said, handing one to Caleb. Thanks, Caleb replied, accepting the cup. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared history unspoken, but understood. You were right about one thing, Whitaker said finally. This gallery needed to change. And you were the one to do it. I'm grateful to be a part of it. Caleb smiled. It's not just my gallery, Mr. Whitaker. It's a space for everyone. And I hope it always will be. As they stood there, surrounded by the art that had once been a source of division but now symbolized unity, Caleb felt a profound sense of fulfillment. His journey had been anything but easy, but it had led him to this moment, a moment of justice, growth, and legacy. And he knew, deep in his heart, that this was only the beginning.